Earlier this year, my paper, Drying the Mud for Justice Disrupted Indigenous Lifeways, was published in the COABE Journal, the Coalition on Adult Basic Education. There is an accompanying interview, and the link for that is below. I'm going to share some of that paper and talk about why the paper is important, and then also address the concepts of leadership theory. Drying the Mud for Justice is a paper that began for me with a storytelling event with tribal elders in the Chickasaw Nation Aging Division. That morphed into a way of presenting research that not only honors the academic knowledge that's required to do things like pass my classes, but also to infuse that with Indigenous ways of knowing, because those are all too often not recognized in academia, but most especially in highly colonized educational areas like K through 12 and higher education. Long ago, the original Chickasha people were formed by the Creator, by a Babanili, and we were brought to live on this land. In many ways, those lands have changed, and others have claimed ownership of them, but the land remembers us. Our lands were still forming from a mud ball pulled up to dry by our cousins, the crawfish. As our people lay there newly formed and still becoming who they would be, the foshi, the birds, were left still flying around, looking for places to land on the wet mud of that early homeland. Unable to land where it was still so wet, they had a problem. The chala, the blackbird, said they would solve this on their own. Still flying, they soared around and around, using the air from their wings to dry the mud. Where the great wings of the chala went down, the mud dried in the shape of valleys. Where their wings went up, the mud formed tall mountains. Today, some of those mountains have been excavated, trails blaze through them, and new laws govern it all. For many of our people and others brought to our lands alongside their siblings, those laws have created more problems than they could ever hope to solve. Many of our people do not have the tools we once had to make our way through life. We have had to learn new ways of knowing and doing, and new life ways that do not honor the spirits that live within us. Some of these problems are caused by boundaries drawn by others, by laws we never asked for. Some of these problems came with colonization and differing ideas of what it means to be successful. Those same ideas that change the way that leadership operates on Turtle Island in the Americas holds over to business and nonprofit and educational leadership now, with our focus, with my focus on decolonizing educational spaces. We bring different and not new, but new to some of these spaces, leadership models that sometimes align with current leadership theory and sometimes do not. With some theories like contingency leadership theory and those models, the behavioral aspects that are used in those models are highly aligned to Anglo and European ways of thinking and of doing things. So while they're looking for the best leadership style to fit a situation, they're not really taking into account the individual people or the cultural aspects of the people that they're attempting to lead. So as they're looking at behaviors, those may be misinterpreted, and then leadership therefore cannot be as effective. One area that for me has been extremely enlightening in looking at how networking and leadership can and should be decolonized is my work with an organization called the Open Door Collective. Um, Within that collective, there are professionals, adult learners, leadership from many different organizations, not all of which are educational in programming or in nature, but they look to the issues, not just poverty itself, but the colonial issues, the settler issues that have made poverty um, such a prevalent state for so many people. Um, and while it is true that there are people of all races, creeds, classes who experience poverty, it is also true that the majority of those who live in extreme poverty with very little resources are people of color, indigenous, black, Asian, queer people, etc. So, working with the ODC has shown me personally, and I'm sure others, that while the situations may be similar, there is no one way to lead in those situations, because as many leaders as we have, there are also that many people or more who are attempting to fall under our leadership and to follow the theories and the methods that we're using to replicate the programs that we're creating. And not all programs created, say, on the East Coast are going to work in the rural Midwest or in, um, you know, urban Oregon or in an indigenous reservation versus an urban society. So that work of taking those methods and removing from them the qualities that make them hinge on these colonized aspects of thinking, of these assimilated ideals of education, becomes more and more important. And doing that with a nationwide network of people who are also working in those same issues, who are dealing with adult learners who can't speak English, or adult learners and their families who may not be able to access resources because of citizenship or legal issues. Um, there's an entire page on the Open Door Collective's website um, dedicated to the research and the papers that our issues groups have been working through on the academic side, and then putting that research into the hands of the practitioners who can actually use it in ways that don't come out as legalese or academic speak, but as usable language and usable mediums that can actually be put in place without having to be translated for a layman or an adult learner even to understand. Another leadership model, the continuum model in theory, is along the same lines, sort of used as um, a way to determine what leadership style to select. In this scenario, though, we're looking at the role or the hierarchy of the person or people that are interacting, um, along with the situation or the time frame to maximize performance. This is another issue where decolonization would remove a lot of the stress and the emphasis put on productivity over human beings. So, for this leadership style, the variables and the forces at play become, for me, less important, not because the final end product is not important, but because I know that in a leadership scenario where people are treated as people and everyone is equal, it becomes a scenario where people are willing to put in the effort and work together to create bigger and better things rather than doing the bare minimum so that their boss isn't upset with them. Um, and that is something that is not addressed with the continuum model, um, because it also invites opportunity for constant change, which people don't do well with. I think that's something that we've all learned as a result of the pandemic, that we don't necessarily deal well with fast or long term change. Um, so that is an issue with that theory. Um, Another theory, the path goal leadership model, again, is used to select the leadership style based on a situation. Um, and they're looking for um, like a supportive or a participative or an achievement oriented outcome. Um, the difference here is that we're looking at both performance and job satisfaction, which is not something that the previous theories really went into in much depth. Again, because they're focused on outcome, not on the individual people. The path goal theory and the motivational theories of goal setting and expectancy put the responsibility for the happiness and well-being of the subordinates on the leadership. And that is something that, again, with decolonization, we look more to the group as a whole to um, take all of those tasks into consideration rather than putting all individuals' well-being on the leader alone. Um, with substitutes for leadership, looking at characteristics um, of the task and the organization to replace leadership or neutralize a leader's behavior. This can be important when you have situations where a leader is being replaced or where there's some succession happening in an organization. But for the most part, in an indigenous mindset, we see the grooming of that leader who is stepping up over a long time period. So that person would be allowed to come in and kind of serve as an apprentice um, and learn not just what they will need to do, but pick up tools and tips or see things that they don't want to do in their own leadership as they continue the process. Um, Moving toward a leadership style of action and communication rather than um, stepping into these very rigid roles and theories and models feels more natural and less like a prescription for leadership. With longstanding issues in many educational communities, going back to um, Anglo and Western educators and funders and program supporters who are coming in from a very privileged point of view, looking at all of these people who, in their minds, need their help to be more like them, um, moving away from that to a decolonized mindset in educational spaces where we're looking at people who have their own culture and their own ways of living and knowing and doing things, being given the tools to be able to do those things in the ways that are comfortable and natural for them without bringing them to a place where they feel they have to assimilate in order to succeed is, to me, more important than the academic aspect of leadership.